and the three W's turned up along with everybody else, and it was a totally different game. And my dad took me to Lancaster Park. I don't remember much about that game, but I remember when they returned about 3 years later. And it was very much from then on I became a West Indies supporter, and because they were just so good and they were so different. I grew up, went to school, went to high school, got selected into an advanced coaching side, um, and one of our first coaches was Peter White, who many members here will probably recall from, I think, Somerset from memory. Long-term player, really great player, and the Caribbean just started to get into the way I played the game and the way I thought about the game. Went to university, started becoming an historian, and then started rereading all my cricket books, as an historian does, as opposed to a chronicler of the game. And I started to see that there was, of course, a lot more to this game in the Caribbean than just a physical activity. Along comes CLR James and Beyond a Boundary, you know, wonderfully advertised in my local library as the greatest cricket book ever invented. I read it and did not understand a word of it the first 3 or 4 times around. I think I've read it about 30 plus times now, and I understand a bit more about it. But of course, that was the way it got. And then I trained as an historian, moved on, and started as an historian of India because no one would actually allow me to write a thesis on cricket because that was seen as too trivial. But then, having done the PhD, I was able to move sideways, and that took me off into the sports world that I inhabited for quite a while. But the West Indies never went away.
So 3 decades after your introduction to Worrell and Weeks and Walcott and Ram and Val, you made that journey, a field trip really, in old money to the West Indies. And what I want you to do for us, if you can, Brian, is take us inside a Bridgetown rum shop late one night in 1985, because this was the era of Garner and Holding, Richards, Greenwich and Haynes. And I want you to explain to us what cricket meant to those men and women in that rum shop that night. And how did these people feel about their cricket?
Yeah, it's a wonderful story, Simon. As you know, it sort of opens the book in a way about why it was so important. This is about 2 in the morning. There'd been an important game at Kensington. I was hosting some fairly prominent cricket administrators and ex-players who were in town for a veterans match. And we're in this rum shop up Baxter Road that then was sort of the social centre. And sitting at a table next to us were these three professional rum drinkers. And they were talking serious cricket. And what we could make out from in the West, I could pick up a bit more of the lilt than some of my friends did, but they were talking very informedly about Australian cricket. And I leaned over to one of them and said, and they were talking about Gary Sobers, and I leaned over to them and said, one of my companions here actually played in the South Australian team with Gary when he was there for the 3 years playing in the 60s. And this little guy at this next table, 2 in the morning, rum in hand, full glass, stands up, draws himself up to about a full height of about 5'6", thrusts the glass in the air and says, Gary, man, Gary come from God. And that was what it was like. I was on the island at that stage. The island's never had more than 250,000 people population. I was there for just over a year. I could have played at least two organised games every day of the year that I was there in some form or another. And that was without all the tape ball cricket, the alley cricket going on, the beach cricket, obviously, that I'm sure some people have seen. It was just, it's not even a passion. It's a religion, or it was. And I've always used it in a lot of the teaching that I've done about sport because Australians and New Zealanders, and I think Brits, are brought up to believe that they are really passionate about sport. I don't think, yeah, we know about South American football, but we keep forgetting about what West Indian cricket was like. And it's of course changed, and we can talk about that later. But it was a meaning of life in many ways because it unlayered all sorts of things about Barbadian society, and that's really what the book's about. Because the argument I've got is that as the game developed from the mid 19th century onwards, it played a really significant role in the way in which society was stratified between the haves and the have-nots. And it's it's in a sense it's an in-depth investigation of the sort of argument that C.L.R. James was putting up, that it emphasises how significant it was in Barbados, because as we know, West Indies do not exist apart from the cricket team and the university. Otherwise, you've got a series of independent island nations which are very different from each other, which explains some of the chemistry or lack of chemistry in the creation of West Indian teams and West Indian organisation. So this Barbados story is really a touchstone to all of that in trying to come to understand why the Caribbean is the way it is now.
And of course, you weren't just studying the game, Brian. You decided extraordinarily to play it as well. And that meant very quickly you had to choose who to play for. And there'll be people watching tonight who know well that passage in Beyond the Boundary by C.L.R. James,
Yeah,
one of the most famous parts of the book where he has this existential crisis when he decides to play for Maple over Shannon and
yeah.
everything that that meant in terms of race and class and aspiration. And you had to make a similar decision. And just to give people an insight, you write in the book at this time and you name the clubs, the significant clubs of Barbados, and you say Wanderers was for the plantocracy, Pickwick, the white middle class, Spartan, the better off blacks, Empire, not for poor blacks, but different from Spartan, Young Men's Progressive Club, the poor whites with a political tinge, Carlton, those who did not fit into easily into any other club, but who thought they were white. So this isn't just like walking down to your village green and saying, "Can I play on Saturday?" It was an immensely complicated decision. So tell us who you decided to play for and why.
Well, I ended up playing for a team called Maple that was in St James, which was where I happened to be living.
Mhm.
And it had emerged effectively out of an entirely separate competition. And you know, you've mentioned all of those Barbados Cricket Association teams, Simon, Wanderers and so on. Now, here's an island of 250,000 people. From the early 1930s until really into the 1980s, and only disappeared very recently, there was an entirely separate competition called the Barbados Cricket League. And it was from there that Gary and Everton and all of those wonderful players emerged. And we can talk about how all that happened. But this was, you know, basically the clubs stratified the society. So I got there. It was starting to change because obviously the demographics had shifted, and this is now about 25 years or so after independence. So all sorts of things have started to shift socially. But I got an offer to play for Wanderers, and my cricket brain basically said, I would love to play for Wanderers, except that if I did, I thought there'll be a lot of people who will not feel comfortable in talking to me about their cricket experiences simply because of where it is. So my great colleague at the University of the West Indies, Sir Woodville Marshall, spoke to some people he knew, and I ended up playing for Maple, which was one of the newer clubs. It was an out of fringe sort of lower, a lower social status club. And I turned up there to play. Now, that decision uh, led to one of the really great moments of the whole time because I did a radio interview with the wonderful Tony Cozier, who many people will remember with great affection. Um, and it went very well. And I asked him if he had a contact for Everton Weeks. And he said, "Oh, yeah, I do, but that might be difficult." So I badgered him into giving me this number, and I rang this number, and this voice answers at the end. And I said, "Mr. Weeks, I'm here from Australia. I'm researching cricket. I wonder if I can talk to you." There's a very long silence. And he said, "Are you the Australian playing for Maple?" And I said, "Yes." And he said, "You can come and talk to me." And it was just one of those moments when you know that you've made the right decision for once, because I think had I played for Wanderers, it might not have happened.
Yeah.
And that in itself is a marker of just how structured this cricket situation was in this very tiny island.
Yeah, and more than that, I think your research would have been flawed if you'd played for Wanderers in a way. Can you explain why that would have been?
Well, I think it's partly because of the access. Um, One of the things that happened, because I was playing for Maple, word went round very quickly, and I got approached by a lot of people who wanted to talk cricket, who probably would not have spoken to me if I'd played for this other team. Now, this sounds odd, but it's simply how powerful all of that cricket organisation had come.
Mm.
And the, yeah, one of the great moments, I had the privilege of going back to Barbados in 2003 to deliver the Frank Worrell Memorial Lecture. And I'd made a very great friend there, and I was talking about some of this in the lecture. And he had been a stalwart at Empire, which was sort of the Herman Griffith organised team that was always the tough team. It was sort of at the bottom of the pecking order, but produced all these fantastic players. And Simon, you've been in the Empire club rooms. You've seen all the photographs of all the Test players who represented it. And my friend, after this talk, said, and I've been talking about who I played for, and he said, "Why didn't you come and play for us at Empire?" And I said, "I didn't think you'd have me in." And that was the way in which this game was organised. It was very socially structured, and that's only really started to break down a lot now. So someone like Craig Brathwaite is now captaining Wanderers most recently, but that's happened in the last few years, really. It's taken a long time for this game that was structured in the mid to late 19th century to really change in any reasonable form at all in terms of access and equity. But of course, that's all become challenged by other sorts of opportunities. But it was for a very long time so rigidly structured. And there's lots of stories in the book about how that affected individual players. So one of the Hodes who played for Pickwick worked for a sugar plantation whose owners supported Wanderers. And there were always stories about when those two clubs clashed. Um, you know, the Hode the Hode manager would suddenly be required to work overtime on a Saturday and not be able to turn up and play for Pickwick against Wanderers. It was that serious.
And you turned up, I think it might have been a Tuesday night for your first net session at Maple, um, as if you weren't standing out enough as the only white man at the club. You had a particular piece of equipment that made things a lot worse that evening.
I did. People will have worked out that with the advent of helmets, largely after the '77 World Series cricket stuff, um, I'd started using a, a helmet. There weren't, as you'll remember, there weren't all that many around at that stage. And in Australia, you could only get this one brand, or at least in Perth, you could get one brand um, and one colour, which happened to be white. Uh, so I turned up to practice, and they found the four quickest guys they could find in the club, and they had a go at me. It was good fun.
Now, I'm not going to share the screen because I'll probably shut us all down, but here is Brian playing for Maple against Bristol, I think. Nice
Yeah,
braced front leg there, Brian. You
I
could
was,
obviously get some pivot. What did you do? What were your attributes?
I'd started off as an opening bat, and then drifted down to the middle order, sort of batting about five or six,
Hmm.
and bowling by then off spin, which was actually great because, as I discuss in the book, the domestic cricket season in Barbados is still played largely in the wet season. And that was because of the importance of the sugar industry. Because back in the old days, they played when the sugar wasn't being harvested, which was in the obvious time that you would play cricket, which is when all the internationals are played now, sort of in the dry. But of course, you could get some very, very wet tracks. And being an off spinner was really great when that was happening. It was terrific.
You were there as an academic as well as a player. How did you? I'm interested to know how you resolved that sort of dichotomy between being both a participant and a recorder.
That's kind of an anthropology question, Simon, which is a very good one. And it's one of the reasons I've always been very grateful that I actually studied India before I did anything else of this kind. And the reason was because there's an American sociologist called C. Wright Mills who had a wonderful book called The Sociological Imagination. And there's a wonderful chapter in it where he says, if you study your own culture, you assume 70% of the knowledge, you don't actually test it out. If you study someone else's, you assume nothing and you read everything. And of course, that's what I did with India. It's what I did actually with the West Indies. So by the time I got there to do this sort of ethnography field work in cricket, as it would be described in anthropology, um, I'd read all the anthropology, I'd read the sociology, I'd read literally everything that you could read on the Caribbean and on West Indies. So what I was doing was really seeing all of the theory, if you like, and seeing all of the stories that I'd seen in history, but then sort of turning up at a ground and seeing crowd reactions and seeing the interactions between clubs and all of those sorts of things. So I was able to really move between those. the- They weren't really separate worlds. They were just on a continuum about what what particular influence I was having at that time and coming to understand this culture in a more deep way, I suppose.
And it was unique. I mean, it's hard to overstate what a unique place Barbados was for very good and also really quite iniquitous reasons. Because, I mean, the thing that's always struck me is by the Second World War, you could have had young black and white men who could have flown in the same bomber aircraft over Germany together, but they wouldn't have been allowed to play in the same cricket team together. And the men that you watched at Lancaster Park in 1952, when they went home to Barbados, they couldn't even vote in an election because they didn't have the status. So you had these amazing men who were really second class citizens despite their own athletic prowess.
Oh, for a very long time, and the story, as you know, Simon, the stories of say Frank Worrell, but particularly Everton Weekes, just underline the point. I mean, Everton was brought up as a poor kid on really on the boundaries of Kensington Oval, grew up in the area called New Orleans. Um, Single parent family, which wasn't that unusual. Poor kid, did some fielding, did a bit of sort of gave net practice to the players at Wanderers um, and at Pickwick, but could not actually play in any of those teams until he joined the Army in 1939. And the Army had a team in the BCA and he was able to play for that. I mean, the famous story, of course, is about Gary Sobers. Um, Gary got started playing in the Barbados Cricket League, but then got into was allowed to was unable to join the police by by Wilfred Farmer, who was a leading figure at Wanderers, and the police had a team in the Barbados Cricket Association as well. So that was a it was a device to get Gary into the BCA, and those things happened sort of all the way through for a very, very long time. Um, and that's why the political story that goes along with it really has a resonance. So the Barbados Cricket League, the leaders of that were really strong leaders in the movement for independence and for equality at the same time leading up to independence in 1966. So there was always this kind of correlation between cricket and politics. And that went through every level. I mean, it's always been said in the Caribbean that if you ever want to get the prime ministers of all the Caribbean islands together, just put on a test match. Um, when I was there in '85, the New Zealanders turned up, and I think the test in Bridgetown, there were at least five prime ministers up in the members area, um, mainly talking about cricket, I suspect, not about politics.
And this was such at times a violent island. It was complicated. It was stratified, as you say, really markedly by race and class and privilege. And yet, in the midst of all this disorder, which went on for large parts of the early 20th century, until after the war, cricket seemed to have a central role for all different stripes of society.
It really does, and this is where it becomes really interesting because there's in many ways there are sort of competing stories. You'll get stories about Pickwick members, middle class whites, collecting or taking lower class other people of other colour, taking them home in their vehicles, uh, entertaining them in some sort of restricted way at the club. So there is no question that it enabled a sort of structured meeting between all of these different social groups. One of the most famous ones, there's a friend of ours still lives in Perth, an Australian woman who married into the managerial class in Barbados. And she remembers the games between Leeward and Windward, which were the plantocracy teams. And they were just great social meetings. The cricket was sort of important, but it was a really good opportunity for those plantocracy groups to actually get together and meet. So there was a lot of structured meeting really going on through cricket. But at the same time, people knew where they had to go. And my friend um, um, David Aline remembered leaving. He had played with a white player at school. They'd opened the batting together. The day they left school, they went out the gate. David went to Empire. The white guy went to Pickwick.
Mm.
They were never going to play together again unless they got into the Barbados team. The white guy did, David. My Aline friend did not. Still thought of as one of the better players who'd never got to play for Barbados. But here was this social structuring at work and demonstrated all the way through.
Now, I just want to say to everyone watching this evening, if you have a question, then please do type it into the chat. And when we come to the end of our talk together, we can ask a few of those questions if you have something of particular interest that you want to share to us. So I please encourage you to type a question into the chat and we can read a couple of them out at the end. Brian, one of the things that, I mean, this really is it is a remarkable book, and it's framed by the depth of your study into the history, the social history of cricket in Barbados and the actual playing of it itself. How easy or how hard was it to find all those sources that built up this really very full picture of life in the island over 150 years?
Some of it was fairly difficult. The Barbados archives are not that extensive. And of course, what we haven't really put front and centre here is that this was all about reorganising society after the abolition of slavery in 1835 and 1834. And what, again, those viewing might be aware, but I'll just sketch it out. Because what really happened in abolition was that the British government borrowed £20 million in 1834 and compensated the slave owners for the loss of slaves. That was repaid in 2015, I would point, some of you may know. Um, what that did was it enabled Barbados, and this was a bit different from the other islands. It was almost impossible for freed slaves to actually buy land immediately. And it took a very long time before they were able to buy their own property. And what happened was that all sorts of social manoeuvres were put in legislation, the legal system, the very organisational system, and I argue in cricket. This was part of a restructuring of society that maintained the same sorts of social distances between the various community groups after 1834 as had happened under slavery. So all of this was being worked out over a century or so, yet not all of that was greatly recorded. And even something like trying to find the origins of some of the really important um, players from the lower orders, people like Fitzhines, who I talk a lot about in the book. He was on the first West Indies tour to England in 1900, marvellous player. But it's only really very recently that we've discovered who he really was. And that took a lot of work. Giles Wilcock did some marvellous work on some follow-up things that I'd established first. Um, whereas in here, we finding those sorts of genealogical things is relatively straightforward. It's not so simple in that place because, of course, you're dealing with post-slavery and different naming of people and the way in which structures and relationships were organised. Um, Similarly, a lot of the actual social history itself, not particularly well recorded, um, meant going through a lot of the newspaper material, and you've experienced how much fun that is. Um, but it was really doing a lot of work, and some of the really good material I got was really through interviews with some of the players that no one outside Barbados had ever heard about. You can talk to a lot of the others who were there, but it was talking to some of the lesser known players that I think it did two things. It got me a very different view about what was going on down at the grassroots, and it also opened up a lot of other people to come and talk to me. So some of the connections came through people, who had found really um, that I was a bit more approachable having played for Maple, which takes us back to that start. So, I mean, any historical investigation like this is difficult, but this one was probably more difficult than most.
Give us a flavour of your season as a player at Maple. What were the grounds like? Who watched the game? Where did you get changed? You're allowed to give us briefly one of your best innings or describe a fifer for us. And how did you fit into that team?
With great difficulty. First practice, so the, the organisation, and people understand this, so the club had one home ground near where we were living. So that meant we could have two teams, and the matches were played over 3 weekends. So they were fairly long and intense, depending on whether the rain was in or not.
So
But
this
it
is
meant,
three consecutive Saturdays for one.
yes,
Yeah,
yes.
two innings.
So you have two teams, 22, 24 if you've got 12 men. I turned up to the first practice and there were, I think it was 75 or 80 players or something there. So I didn't get selected the first round, but I then got in. It was the practices were open wicket, no nets, just play out on the pitch. Fielding was basically just fielding to whatever was coming from most of the batting going on. Incredibly competitive because there weren't many places available. Home, we actually had. I played a. I ended up playing for the second team pretty much all the season. Um, didn't quite crack first, which was, a bit disappointing. There was one of the great things was on selection nights, there was usually money changing hands as to whether I'd get selected for the first or not, and a lot of people lost money, I think. Um, and that, of course, the selection nights were long, accompanied by a lot of discussion fueled by rum. Um, and then on important games, we played one game, I think we had about 5,000 spectators at Maple. Um, and we would turn up to these other grounds and there'd be really good crowds, hundreds of people.
5,000 spectators.
Yeah, it was massive. I've got the photographs are incredible.
That's
There was
unbelievable.
people everywhere around. Well, you've seen the Maple ground. It was
Yeah.
completely surrounded by people. Um, a lot of the grounds were very small. My favourite one, which is Bristol, the one you showed, was up in Speightstown, up sort of the top end of the island, up a bit of a hill, and it was actually on a slope, and it was very small. So I think there were twos and threes rather than fours and sixes. And the slope, there was one memorable occasion when the ball actually went down the slope, got onto the road coming into the ground, and then round halfway back down to Speightstown, I think, down the hill. Um, uh, the grounds frequently were really wet. I remember we turned up at the hospital to play on the hospital ground, and we actually all stood around the boundary while our guys were batting to try and stop the ball going into the drains that were full of water. It was just atmospheric to say the least. Um, then we actually played one game at Kensington, which was great. Um, didn't do very well. Um, had a fairly reasonable season. The fun, and I talk about this in the book. We turned up at Lodge School, and I got a fairly reasonable start, and then got run out by our captain. Um, and it was a bit like Steve Smith, where the bat reached the dressing room before the player did. Um, and all of my pals were hugely intrigued by this. And I drafted up a small book, which was the art and wisdom of running between wickets, by this captain, put his name on it, and it was 14 pages that were completely blank. Um, and they loved it. It was just so much fun. Um, because it was a really serious, the selection nights would go for 3 or 4 hours. There'd be endless discussion out in the middle after a game. It was just this religion that I was talking about rather than this passion.
Mm. And what I think is probably unique to the West Indies that you experienced at first hand was this connection between club cricketers and world famous international stars. All of these men were made from the same pitches.
Absolutely. Um, and I see
No,
someone
there was
said
no
that
divide between them. There was no separation.
no, and a lot of all of that um, persisted for a long time. I mean, the year I played there, Malcolm Marshall played, I think, 3 club games. Joel Garner played a couple. Um, Desi Haynes was around because he played for Carlton, um, and they were at least around and sort of talking to it. It's become less common, obviously, as these guys have been picked up by the franchises. Um, but it was the glue because, and you look at someone like Desi, came from a place called Holders Hill, which was out near us in St James. You come out of Bridgetown and go north, and there's this. It was one of the famous cricket nurseries. Franklin Stevenson came from there. A whole bunch of players. who'd come through the Barbados Cricket League, a club called St John the Baptist that was associated with one of the churches there. Um, all of these guys stuck together for a long time, and even when some got elevated, but they all maintained those sort of contacts. Um, I see someone talking about the matches that, yes, they were over 3 Saturdays and they were 2 innings per team if you could manage it. Some days they only lasted 2 days because the wickets were so wet, everyone was out for 55 or 60. Um, and other days when it was fine, there was very big scores. So it was a regular sort of game, but it was played over 3 weekends, which was unusual because I've been used to playing in Australia at that stage. Just we only played over 2 weekends. These were fairly serious matches, and they'd always been over 3 weekends as well. Because you go back and some of the scores back in the 1920s, 700 and 800 in a club game, with George Challoner and those sort of players being really successful.
Now, you speak to so many great players and players that no one has heard of in your book, Brian. And one of the guys that you did speak to, when I did my book about Worrell, I painted him, I admit, slightly as a little bit of a baddie, and that's John Goddard, who was the white captain of the
Yeah.
1950 team and the 1957 team. And I think it's fair enough to say that he slightly held back the development of West Indian cricket, I would say. But you got to meet him. What sort of man was he like, and what were your impressions of him?
Well, we're all complicated. Um, and John Goddard was a complicated guy because he was out of really what was identified in Barbados as the poor white tradition. Um, his dad had worked very hard, got them up to the point where they played for Pickwick. They were really strong and very competitive. The family was well known. They'd gone into business. And of course, they grew up in an environment where there was a very clear separation of communities and a separation of power and authority. Now, what had happened in Barbados around the time of the First War, sugar had always been the major economic input, obviously. From the late 19th century onwards, the prices started to soften, things got a little structured, a little difficult. So the business community and the plantocracy got very streamlined around sort of 1910, between 1910 and 1920, into Plantations Limited, which was effectively the plantocracy and the production of sugar that was highly organised. And then there was Barbados Shipping and Trading, which was the group that dealt with it all. And everybody sort of structured in around that. The Goddards were in the middle of that, very powerful family. And of course, they grew up with very strong traditions about who was in charge and who wasn't. And that really flowed through into cricket. And there were very strong debates about that, about who could play for some of these teams, who could not play. A lot of that was self-imposed, but some of it was really socially imposed. Some of the major leaders of the Barbados Cricket Association were very strong on who could be in charge and who could not be. And of course, that led to the whole story up to 1959, which you know very well, which was the elevation of Frank Worrell as the first real black captain of West Indies. That was reproduced really inside Barbados too, because Goddard was Barbados captain as well as West Indies captain for a long time. And some of his relationships with some of those leading players, like Everton Weekes, was fairly fractured to say the least. Um, but when I spoke to him, um, yeah, he was a product of the system. He
Yeah.
saw the world in a very different way that, say, Everton would have, in a very different way from what I saw coming, a generation or so later. Um, and it was really fascinating because I was talking to all these people who had all these very different experiences growing up at exactly the same time. Um, and trying to piece together really how the whole sort of ecosystem started to work. And it was incredibly complicated. Um, and they would always explain that, of course, there was always good relationships between all of these community groups. It's just when you went and talked to individuals, you started to get a very different story. And it wasn't just sort of black versus white. There were also the class elements and all of those other things that threaded through it, in making a very, very interesting but very intricate story.
Mm. This was one of the best years of your life, and you write very tellingly that you cried when you, in the days before you left the island, because you were leaving it all behind. But to follow on from what you've been saying, you had a very telling conversation on the street because you encountered a leading cricket administrator and he said, I hear you're leaving Stoddart. And you said, sadly, yes, I'll be dragged to the plane kicking and screaming. And he said, it's just as well you're going. And you said, why? Because, and then he replied, sooner or later, you'd have to have chosen between them and us.
Yes. And so this is 1980, the end of 1985. You know, slavery had been abolished in 1834. The country had become democratic, or had become um, independent in 1966 with a cricket match to mark the occasion, of course. Um, and yet all of those social patterns prevailed.
Mm,
Um, and that comment came directly from the fact that I had chosen to go and play for Maple, because what he saw was that I had chosen to side with a particular social group, and therefore, I mean, to his mind, I just didn't understand how the island worked. Now, of course, it's going to be very interesting to see um, how the response to all of this comes out, because that system was very complicated and people read things socially in the way in which they need to read them or the way in which they've been brought up to read them. So my reading of that might be very different from someone else. So there'll probably be some differences of opinion over some of my interpretations, I expect. But when I first went there, a lot of people were actually very positive about me doing it because they thought it needed to be written and they thought it was impossible for them to do it, which I'd found absolutely astonishing, really. Um, and because there was this, it meant way more than the game. It was definitely beyond a boundary in this case. And I think what I've done is really take, I mean, I've always thought that CLR James, there was a little bit of that intricacy of the microsystem, if you like, in Trinidad, that I would have loved to have had him do the full sort of archaeology excavation. And I think that's what I've tried to do with Barbados, to show how it really permeated into every facet of the island's life. It directed people's lives. It influenced the way in which they thought about a whole range of things. I mean, cricket was almost a litmus test about the evolution of Barbados from that slave, post-slave, sort of post-independence environment, and it's still reverberating in some respects.
mm. And you write about those things with such clarity and insight. Yet it was 40 years ago now, more than 40 years. It's half a generation, and so much has changed in the Caribbean since then. I was reflecting that it's probably impossible for someone like you or I to write that kind of book now, really. But where are the young Caribbean cricket writers? Where are the young men and women who could carry that story forward? Because I really don't see them anywhere.
Well, I think the backdrop to that comment, Simon, is of course what's happened to cricket itself. And perhaps the telling story that I've got in the book is that um, I went back a couple of years ago, spent a month in the domestic season, just walking around and sort of testing the testing the waters, as it were, and went back to my old club. Now, remember, the first practice I turned up to, say 75 or 80 players, the first Tuesday I was back on the island, I turned up to Maple just out of curiosity. There were
Yeah.
10.
Yeah.
And of course, that was the absolute sort of symbolizing of the way in which the game has changed in the Caribbean. I mean, we look now, I mean, was unheard of, but you look now at matches being telecast, test matches from Kensington, there's no one there. The crowds are not turning up. The players are not there. They've got a whole range of other social options. They're really fixated on, say, going to American colleges for athletics or other pursuits. Um, if they're playing cricket, of course, and this takes us up into the global game and the way in which that's changing, in my view, largely because of the influence of India and the way in which uh, the financing of international cricket is happening now. The Barbados and the West Indies are really struggling from that. So, of course, all their leading players end up contracted to all the franchises for the T20 versions.
Yeah.
And a lot, so you look at someone like Kyron Pollard, who's scarcely played in the Caribbean. Um, and that's had a dramatic impact on the actual look of the game on the ground. Um, I talked to, spent a bit of time talking to the guy who was the president of Maple when I went back a couple of years ago, and he was explaining just how difficult it is to get players in. A lot of the better players want to be paid to play club cricket. Um, they're trying to find options elsewhere to really maximise their financial opportunity. Um, so whereas there's still a professional class coming up. The I didn't get selected for the last match that I was eligible for either because um, the the season finished in England. And I think half of the first planes that arrived back in Barbados were full of professional players who were either in the counties or in the leagues or elsewhere, and they all arrived, and I was sort of on the end of the conveyor belt. Um, that's not nearly so pronounced these days. It's still there. Obviously, there are some players, and of course, the very interesting story is Jacob Bethell, playing for England now, chose to qualify for England rather than to play for Barbados. Um, that's again another sort of symbol of this kinds of things that's happening, all of this. Um, and that's really changed the dimension of the game in the Caribbean. We know, games effectively sort of reflect the societies that produce them. And as societies change, then all sorts of other things change as well. So we've had the rise of ODI and T20 and all of those other forms. That's all extremely important stuff, but it's had a very big impact on the way in which the game has not evolved, I think, in the Caribbean and in Barbados specifically.
Mm. Brian, we've been going for over 50 minutes. It's absolutely flown by. There's a couple of questions here. There's a question about Sobers, which I think is very interesting because it says how much did his influence play a part in the gradual societal change in Barbados, given his profile as one of the great cricketers of all time? And did he do enough? And should he have done more?
Oh, super question, and of course, a very difficult one to answer. I talk in the book um, about Gary going to play in South Africa at a time when South Africa was being boycotted, and he got a really lucrative offer to do it and chose to do it, and then came back and, of course, was mightily criticised for doing
Yeah.
it. This is what it suggests is that I mean, there's several things about Gary. He was the cause of me missing the only class I missed in my honours year at university because he was he clashed with a tutorial and the tutorial lost out very seriously. Um, I had a Gary Sobers bat. I had he was the ultimate, but Gary was a product of the system and sort of in a sense didn't understand this. He was a seriously good. He was one of those players who never really realised how good he was because he just expected everybody else to be as good as him, and they couldn't be. Um, and a lot of people will say he didn't do nearly enough to advance the cause for social change and all of those sort of things. But
Mm.
in many respects, he did by example because what he demonstrated was what was possible from some of these players. I mean, he made that he made that huge score at the age, at a very young age, which demonstrated just what the potential was for that social group in Barbados and in the Caribbean, which people wouldn't have realised otherwise. Um, but Gary was, Gary kind of floated through all of these things. And yes, it is easy, I think, to be critical. But again, I think knowing the system that was in there, because Gary, in a sense, was the exception that proved the rule. Um, he got to do things that other people couldn't do simply because of how good he was, which sort of reinforced the point that cricket was important. But looking at those other people, you could see how the rest of the social order bore in on cricket as well.
Yeah. And of course, James said that he was the great exemplar of the people. He was of the people in a way that no other West Indian cricketer had ever really been. And of course, Worrell chose him as his successor over
Yeah,
Conrad Hunt, who
yeah,
everyone else thought may have been a better captain.
yeah.
Um, And Chris Coleman says he says mentioning Sobers last Saturday saw the last cricket to be played at St Helens in Swansea, the home of Sobers' Six Sixes. The ground will be rugby only from now on. So there's a sign of the times.
Well, there's another social change.
Yeah, and Anthony writes. He said, "I love playing in Barbados." He mentions Peter Short and Norman
Yeah,
Marshall and wonders if you mention them in the book from Wanderers. But he says, "P.S. Where did you play your cricket in Australia, Brian? I played for North Melbourne CC." He says.
very good. I played for the University of Western Australia and Nedlands in WA, uh, and played a few games for ANU in Canberra, but then um, played for North Canberra as well.
And because you're a weak Kiwi, you walked after you edged it behind in one game. And
Oh,
that's the postscript.
my very first game in Australia. You remember right back to the start of this conversation, Simon, about you know different cricket cultures. I grew up in New Zealand, which was a very English culture. I mean, you played properly and you had clean gear and all of that stuff, and you played by the rules. Very first game I play for UWA, I'm playing in seconds. I think I got to 35 or something. Nicked one, caught behind, bat under the arm, walked off. Got back into the dressing room, and our captain, and I won't use the exact language, um, but he grabs me by the shirt, shoved me into the wall, and says, "What do you think you're doing?" I said, "I hit it, I'm out." And he said, "Mate, you're in Australia now. The umpire tells you you're out." And of course, at that, but there were no neutral umpires. It was our guys umpiring their turn at the stumps. So it was pretty clear that the appeals would have been turned down, I think. Would not have
Brian,
happened in New Zealand.
exactly. Yes. Yes. It's been such a treat to talk to you, and it's been such a treat to get to know you over these past couple of years. And thank you for everything you've done for me. Um, when I read my first West Indian cricket book, which you edited with Hilary Beckles, I assumed from you being on the title and your quality of your writing that you were West Indian as well. So it was a great surprise to actually see you on our first ever Zoom call. I cannot recommend this book highly enough. It really is quite exceptional. And if you want it delivered in the next 20 minutes, you can get it on Amazon. But there are a couple of other routes where you can get the book from as well, Brian. Is that right?
Um, I think people may know Ken Peace and Roger Page, the Australian booksellers. they've got copies of it as well if people wish to go elsewhere uh, apart from Amazon. And I think they've still got signed copies left. I'll make sure they've still got some more, and I will be trying to get them into a couple of outlets here in the UK as well through sort of cricket providers. It's been a bit it's come up a bit too quick so far.
Thank you so much for your time and thank you for your insight. It's been a real treat to read this book, and I hope that for some of the people watching this call this evening, they can get into it as well, and you will not be disappointed. So I want to wish you all the best with it, and thank you very much, and thank you to everyone who's taken part this evening. It's been a lovely occasion.
Oh, Simon, thanks so much, and thanks to everybody for tuning in, and thanks to the society. It's been a great privilege to be here. I really appreciate it. And if you want to jot down my email address, if you want to get in touch, I'm very happy to sort of take questions outside. All lowercase, B for Brian, dot Stoddart, Stoddart, at bigpond.com, bigpond.com. I'd be very happy to hear from anybody. So
And with
thanks
that,
again.
yep, thank you very much. Thank you, Brian. Thank you, everyone, and good night.